Come on, people. We are burning daylight. Cables are hot. Watch your step. Where's the gaffer? We're behind. Almost there, boss. Check that continuity. Let's move.
It's a Tuesday morning in the third week of September, 1971. The sun has been up for 47 minutes over the Warner Brothers backlit in Burbank, California. Stage 12 is already humming. Grips moving cable, costume assistants threading through the narrow corridors between equipment crates, the director's chair occupied but fidgeting. 114 people are assembled, paid, caffeinated, and ready. The call sheet says 7 a.m. First shot. It is now 9:22 a.m. But dressing room B, a white aluminum trailer parked on the western edge of the lot, 23 feet long, shaded by a single California pepper tree, has not opened its door once. Not for the second assistant director, who knocked at 7:15 and got silence. Not for the craft services woman who left a thermos of black coffee on the step at 8 o'clock and returned at 8:45 to find it untouched. Not for the director, who had stood outside the trailer for 11 minutes at 9:05, speaking in a low, careful voice to a man who did not answer. 64 years old. 223 films to his name. An Academy Award sitting 6 months warm on his mantle at home in Newport Beach. John Wayne, the most bankable star in Hollywood history, had been inside that trailer for 2 days and 22 hours, and nobody on that lot, nobody in the studio hierarchy, nobody in the press corps that would spend the next 4 decades asking questions, knew the real reason why. They would spin theories. They would invent crises. They would attribute it to ego, to illness, to contract disputes, to a late-life crack-up. Every one of those explanations was wrong. This is that story. To understand what happened in that trailer, you have to understand what had been building for approximately 9 months before the door closed. And you have to understand the world John Wayne was navigating in September of 1971, because that world looked nothing like the one that had built him. Hollywood in 1971 was a city mid-surgery. The old studio system, the one that had handed young Marion Morrison a contract at Fox in 1928 and shaped him into John Wayne across 4 decades, was bleeding out. The consent decrees of 1948 had broken the vertical monopoly, television had shredded the guaranteed audience, and now a new generation of filmmakers, young men with European influences and countercultural contempt for the Western genre, were dismantling everything Wayne had spent a lifetime building. The numbers told the story plainly. In 1953, Westerns had accounted for 31% of all Hollywood productions. By 1971, that figure had dropped to 4%. The films being celebrated, The French Connection, Dirty Harry, Klute, were urban, morally fractured, operating on a register of alienation that Wayne found not just commercially threatening but philosophically offensive. He had said so publicly more than once. That was part of the problem. The production in question was a film tentatively titled The Train Robbers, eventually released in February of 1973. It was a Warner Brothers project, a relatively modest Western by Wayne's standards, budgeted at approximately $4 million, directed by Burt Kennedy, who had worked with Wayne before on The War Wagon and Support Your Local Sheriff. The story was straightforward. A widow enlisting a group of aging cowboys to recover gold stolen by her late husband. Wayne was cast as Lane, the lead, a man defined by stubborn loyalty and a refusal to explain himself. That last detail, in retrospect, carries more irony than anyone recognized at the time. The production had been assembled on a schedule that allowed 28 days of principal photography, beginning the 14th of September. The supporting cast included Rod Taylor, Ben Johnson, Christopher George, and Anne Margaret, who was 30 years old, at the peak of her commercial and critical standing, and who had just come off her Academy Award nomination for Carnal Knowledge. She was not a secondary figure in this production. The studio had made that clear in the billing negotiations. It was not the cast that fractured the schedule in week 1. It was a memo. On the morning of September 17th, a Friday, a 2-page document arrived on the production desk from the Warner Brothers Development and Acquisitions Office. The memo was addressed to Burt Kennedy as director, with copies distributed to 3 named producers and, critically, to the script department. It outlined proposed revisions to the film's final act. Specifically, changes to the character of Lane that would soften his confrontational edges, reframe his central motivation from principled loyalty to more commercially legible romantic attachment, and insert 2 scenes of explicit vulnerability. The language of the memo was measured, as studio language always is. It referred to audience identification opportunities and contemporary resonance and emotional accessibility for broader demographics. It cited focus group data from 2 recent Wayne pictures. John Wayne read that memo on the morning of September 18th. He walked to his trailer at 11:47 a.m. He did not come back out. To understand why that memo landed the way it did, you have to understand what John Wayne actually was in 1971. Not the myth, not the marketing, not the persona that had calcified in the public imagination, but the working man who showed up at 6 every morning and understood filmmaking at a molecular level that most directors half his age hadn't approached. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, and he still weighed close to 220 pounds, though the weight had redistributed over 64 years in ways that spoke to hard physical use. His hands, in the recollection of every co-star and crew member who mentioned them in later interviews, were the first thing you noticed. Not large in an abstract way, but specifically, practically large, the hands of a man who had wrangled horses and managed heavy equipment, and, in dozens of productions across 40 years, performed his own physical work to a degree that routinely surprised new crew members who expected a different kind of star. He moved differently from other men his size. Men of 6'4" and 220 usually move with a consciousness of their size, a slight performance of it, a tendency to duck through doorways, to brace themselves before sitting, to inhabit their body as a thing that required management. Wayne moved as though he had never once thought about how large he was. He sat in his director's chair the way other men stand. He crossed rooms without appearing to cross rooms. His eyes were the second thing people mentioned. Not their color, blue-gray, unremarkable, but their behavior. They did not dart. They settled. When Wayne was looking at something, he was looking at only that thing. And you knew it, and it produced in the people he watched a strange combination of exposure and calm. In the days before the memo arrived, he had been, by every account from that production, completely professional. Present at call, prepared, generous with Anne-Margrethe in their scenes, patient with Kennedy's tendency to run overtime in setup. Ben Johnson, who had known Wayne since the Ford Stock Company pictures of the late 1940s, would say in an interview 17 years later that Wayne in that first week had seemed, if anything, lighter than usual, like he'd decided to enjoy the ride. And then the memo arrived. Nobody on the production saw Wayne read it. His assistant, a man named Burt Minchell who had worked for him since 1965, confirmed later only that Wayne had been alone in his production office when it came in, and that he had emerged 40 minutes later looking, in Minchell's word, settled. Not angry, not distressed. Settled. In the way that a man looks when he has made a decision he is completely at peace with and has no intention of revisiting. He walked to the trailer. He closed the door. Minchell stood at the pepper tree for a moment, watching, then turned away. He would say later that he knew, in that moment, exactly what was happening. Not the specific cause, but the quality of the silence that came from that trailer, that particular absolute stillness, was one he had heard before. Duke was thinking, Minchell said. And when Duke thought, he thought all the way. But here's where it changes. What nobody knew, not Minchell, not Kennedy, not the studio executives who were about to start making phone calls, was that Wayne wasn't simply refusing a memo. He was doing something far more deliberate. Something he had been rehearsing, in one form or another, for 4 decades. By the end of day 1, the production had lost approximately $18,000 in standby costs. That number would matter more as the days accumulated. The phone calls began on the afternoon of the 18th. The first came from the production office, an assistant named Jerry Colbert, 26 years old, 3 months into his first studio job, who knocked on the trailer door and announced, with all the professional steadiness he could assemble, that the director would like a word when Mr. Wayne was available. No answer. The second call came from Burt Kennedy himself, who drove his own car to the lot at 4:15 in the afternoon, parked badly, and stood outside the trailer for 20 minutes in the September heat. Kennedy was 61 years old, a veteran writer-director with a 30-year track record in the Western genre. A man who had been through enough productions to understand that stars were occasionally difficult, and that the protocol for managing this fact involved patience above confrontation. He spoke quietly to the door, explaining that the script changes were preliminary, that they were absolutely open to Wayne's input, that nothing was final. The trailer was silent. Kennedy drove home. He told no one on the production exactly what he'd said or exactly how long the silence after it had lasted. He did tell his wife, in a conversation she would recount in a 2009 interview for a Western film retrospective, that he had stood at that door feeling something specific. Not frustration, not anger, but a peculiar sensation he described as being reminded of something I'd almost forgotten. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. Day 2 brought escalation. The studio's production VP, a man named Richard Lederer, 44 years old, 14 years at Warner Brothers, 56 productions under his management, placed a direct call to Wayne's business manager and delivered the message with careful precision. The production timeline was contractually binding. The delays were accumulating costs that would be attributed to the holdout under standard breach provisions, and the studio expected Wayne on set no later than 7 a.m. on the 20th. Wayne's business manager conveyed the message. The trailer remained closed. The crew, meanwhile, had not been dismissed. Burt Kennedy made the call, brave or foolish depending on who you asked, and people on that production asked for years afterward, to keep the full company assembled and available. Partial days were shot around Wayne's scenes with the supporting cast. Rod Taylor and Ben Johnson worked through their coverage. Anne Margaret, to her credit, arrived at call every morning and worked whatever was available, and she did not speak publicly about the situation during filming or for many years after. But by the morning of day 3, the atmosphere on stage 12 had changed. 114 people, by this point, had developed theories. The Whisper network on a film set operates at a speed that would embarrass intelligence services, and the theories ranged from the plausible, a health crisis, a contract breach, a dispute with Kennedy, to the colorful. Some believed there had been an altercation with someone in the production hierarchy. Some believed Wayne had received bad news from home. One grip, a 29-year-old named Sal Ferrante, who would eventually become a production designer of some note, circulated a theory that Wayne had read a review, a particularly dismissive piece in a film journal, and was refusing to work until his displeasure was formally acknowledged. Ferrante was wrong about the cause. He was not entirely wrong about the mechanism. And that's when the real meeting happened. On the morning of September 20th, day 3, approximately 9 a.m., the trailer door opened. Not all the way. 6 inches, maybe 8. Just enough for a human body to suggest itself in the gap. A stage manager standing 40 feet away would describe it as the door just being open, suddenly, like it had always been open. Wayne's assistant director, a man named Frank Parmenter, who had been standing near the trailer since 7:30, walked over. He was 38 years old, methodical, respected on set, not easily rattled. Parmenter stood at the door. He would say later, in a 1998 interview published in a small industry journal that almost nobody read, that what Wayne said to him in the next 40 seconds was the most clarifying professional conversation of his career. In the first second, Parmenter simply stood. The door was open perhaps 8 inches. The interior of the trailer was dim against the morning light. Wayne kept his shades pulled when he was working alone, always had, a habit that went back to early productions when he'd learned that late-morning California sun made reading impossible. Parmenter could see the outline of Wayne in the camp chair he kept specifically for these moments. A wooden-framed canvas chair, standard military field issue, the kind you could fold and carry under one arm. He had used the same style of chair since his first Republic Pictures productions in the mid-1930s. In the second, Wayne spoke. Frank. Not a question. Not an invitation. Just the name. Parmenter stepped into the doorway. He did not enter the trailer. He understood the distance he was being given. And he stood there while Wayne looked at him in that particular way of his, the look that Parmenter would later describe as being read rather than seen. In the next 10 seconds, Wayne said 4 sentences. Parmenter would reconstruct them in his 1998 interview from notes he had made within 2 hours of the conversation, and the precision of his reconstruction, the specific language, the specific pauses, suggests he treated the exchange with the kind of care that people reserve for conversations they know will matter. The first sentence, "Have you read the memo from Acquisitions?" Parmenter had. Everyone had. The second sentence, "Not the language. Have you read what it's asking?" Parmenter paused. The pause itself was his answer. The third sentence, "They want Lane to explain himself." 5 words. The room went silent, or rather, the doorway went silent, the September morning pressing in from behind Parmenter with its sounds of a film set in cautious operation, and all of it seeming to happen on the other side of a glass wall from where the 2 men stood. Parmenter would spend a considerable portion of his 1998 interview attempting to convey what those 5 words communicated in context, and what he kept returning to was not the words themselves, but the quality of Wayne's voice when he delivered them. Not angry, not plaintive, but carrying something he eventually described as weight without performance. The weight of a man who had spent 43 years in an industry that required constant self-explanation, who had constructed his entire professional identity around the refusal to explain, and who had just been handed a document formally requesting that he become a different kind of man. The 4th sentence. That's not a script problem. That's a character problem. And I won't play a man who can't hold his position. Nobody on that set moved. Not because nobody had heard. The trailer door was open. The lot was quiet in that particular September morning way, and several crew members within range would confirm the exchange in later years. They did not move because something in the delivery of those last 12 words communicated that the conversation had just resolved itself, and that the appropriate response to a resolution is stillness. Wayne stood, not standing up from the chair. He had apparently been on his feet already, near the window where the shade was pulled. He moved to the trailer door, opened it fully, stepped out into the morning. He was wearing the same clothes he'd worn when he walked in 2 days and 22 hours earlier. Dark work trousers, a canvas shirt, his boots. His hair was slightly compressed on one side. He looked, in the description of the craft services woman who saw him emerge, like a man who had just finished a very long letter. He walked directly to stage 12. He stopped at the production desk, picked up the day's call sheet, read it for approximately 90 seconds. He handed it back to the production coordinator, a woman named Diane Park, 24 years old, 6 months into her first feature, and said, "Let's start with the canyon sequence. Ben and Rod first, then I'll come in." Park would later say that she had stood in the presence of 3 other major film stars during her career, and that none of them had produced in her the specific sensation she felt in that moment. Not awe, not fear, not the usual charged atmosphere of star proximity. What she felt was closer to the sensation of watching a very old, very large tree in a windstorm. The understanding that the thing in front of you has a root system you cannot see and cannot measure, and that the wind, whatever its force, has not meaningfully troubled it. The canyon sequence was completed in 4 hours and 12 minutes. Burt Kennedy called it the best day of the shoot. But here's what nobody on that set fully understood yet. What happened next, nobody expected. The memo from acquisitions had not been withdrawn. The studio's position had not changed. The contractual language around the holdout was still technically operative. Every structural condition that had caused the trailer door to close was still in place. Wayne had not resolved any of those conditions. He had simply decided that he had thought about them long enough, and that the thinking had given him what he needed, and that the only remaining question was whether he would play the scene the way it had been written or the way it had been amended. He played it as written, not as an act of defiance, or rather, not primarily as an act of defiance, though defiance was present in it. He played it as an act of precision, a craftsman returning to the specification after confirming, in 2 days and 22 hours of uninterrupted reflection, that the specification was correct. In the 10 weeks of principal photography that followed, the character of Lane was not amended. The scenes of explicit vulnerability that the acquisitions memo had requested were not shot. The reframing of Lane's motivation from principled loyalty to romantic attachment did not make the final cut. The film that was released in February of 1973 contained a character who did not explain himself once in 92 minutes of screen time. The silence beat came, finally, on the last day of principal photography. It was a Tuesday again, as though the calendar had a sense of symmetry, and the final setup was a medium close-up of Wayne Lane, looking at something just off camera. Burt Kennedy called for quiet on the set. The slate snapped, and in the 3 seconds before Kennedy called action, 111 people. The crew had shrunk from the original count, stood on stage 12 in complete stillness, watching a 64-year-old man look at something that wasn't there, and understanding, in the specific way that film sets understand things, that they were watching a man be entirely himself. Kennedy let the camera roll for 11 seconds after calling cut. He never explained why. The private conversation happened on the last afternoon of principal photography, after the final shot was wrapped and the crew was beginning the slow, institutional unwinding of a closed production. Equipment returning to its cases, contracts coming off the wall, the set beginning its reversion to stage space. Kennedy found Wayne at the craft services table, eating from a plate of cold cuts with the methodical focus of a man who hadn't been paying attention to food for several days. Kennedy sat across from him. Neither man spoke for approximately 2 minutes. Kennedy was the one who broke the silence, which surprised him afterward, because he had rehearsed several versions of this conversation in the preceding weeks, and in none of them had he been the one to speak first. What he said, reconstructed from his own account in a 1985 interview with the Directors Guild Journal, was, "I want to understand the 3 days." Wayne looked up from the plate. He held Kennedy's eyes for a moment in that way he had. "How long have you been directing?" he asked. Kennedy said 30 years, give or take. 30 years, Wayne said. "And in 30 years, has anyone ever asked you to direct a man who apologizes for being himself?" Kennedy thought about it, genuinely thought about it, not as a rhetorical pause, but because the question deserved the consideration. He said no. "That memo," Wayne said, "was a script note. But what it was asking for was a confession. Lane confesses that he's wrong for being the way he is. That he needs to become something more. What's the word they use? Accessible. Legible." He set his fork down. "I've been playing men who don't confess for 43 years. Not because confession is weak. Because Lane, specifically, hasn't done anything wrong. And a man who hasn't done anything wrong doesn't confess." Kennedy sat with that. 3 days seems like a long time, he said. "It took me 2.5 days to be completely sure," Wayne said. "The other 12 hours were just quiet." Kennedy would return to this exchange for the rest of his career. He directed 14 more projects after The Train Robbers, television movies, a few theatrical features, episodic work, and in every one of them he described returning, at some point during production, to that specific formulation. A man who hasn't done anything wrong doesn't confess. He applied it not just to characters but to creative decisions, to arguments with network executives, to the particular pressure that the industry generates around artists who refuse to explain their choices. He used it, in other words, as a principle, which is exactly what Wayne had intended. On the last afternoon, before Kennedy left the stage, Wayne extended his hand. Kennedy took it. The handshake lasted perhaps 2 seconds, the duration of an ordinary professional courtesy. But Kennedy would note in his account that Wayne's grip had a quality he hadn't encountered before and didn't encounter again: complete. Not performative, not demonstrative, but complete, the grip of a man shaking your hand while thinking only about shaking your hand. "I'll tell you something," Wayne said, and his voice had dropped slightly, carried now only by the two of them in the diminishing noise of the rap. "The studio will try this again. With the next picture. Different language, same request. What you do with it is your business." Kennedy nodded. "But you'll know what it's asking," Wayne said. "That's the difference." He picked up his plate and walked off the stage. 47 witnesses. 92 days of production. And one lesson that Burt Kennedy spent the rest of his life teaching without. Attribution. Years later, specifically 1988, 17 years after that September morning in Burbank, Burt Kennedy gave a master class at the American Film Institute. The session was nominally about Western filmmaking, its conventions, its decline, its periodic resurrection. He spoke for 90 minutes to 41 graduate students, and by most accounts it was a useful, intelligent talk from an experienced practitioner. But at the 80-minute mark, without announcement or transition, Kennedy stopped talking about Westerns. He told his students about a trailer door that had stayed closed for 2 days and 22 hours. He did not name Wayne by name. He referred to him throughout as the actor. But the students understood, within 2 sentences, exactly who he meant. He told them about the memo, about the language of accessibility and contemporary resonance, about the 4 sentences delivered through a 6-inch gap in a trailer door. He told them what Wayne had said about confession. A man who hasn't done anything wrong doesn't confess. He told them that in 34 years of directing, that was the single most precise statement about character integrity he had ever heard. Not from a writing teacher, not from an acting coach, not from any of the gifted, formally educated storytellers he had worked alongside. From a 64-year-old man in a canvas camp chair, thinking his way through a problem until the thinking was done. 3 of those 41 graduate students would go on to careers of significant note. A feature director whose work would win 2 Academy Awards, a television writer-producer whose long-running series would spend 11 years in the top 10, and a documentary filmmaker whose subjects included a long retrospective on the Western genre itself. All 3, in separate interviews across separate decades, referenced that AFI session. All three cited the same moment. All three used, at one point or another, some version of the same formulation in discussing their own creative decisions. The lesson had propagated, the way genuine lessons do, not by announcement, not by biography, not by the kind of formal transmission that institutions prefer, but by the specific gravity of a true thing finding its way into the work of people who were ready to carry it. John Wayne died in June of 1979. He was 72 years old. The train robbers grossed $11 million against its $4 million budget. The character of Lane, unmodified, unexplained, a man who held his position, was received by audiences and critics alike as one of the more quietly authoritative performances of Wayne's late career. The acquisitions memo that had started everything was filed in the Warner Brothers production archive, where it sat for decades as one of several thousand routine documents. It did not, to any researcher's knowledge, contain a response. Which brings us back to that September morning. The pepper tree, the untouched thermos, the stage manager describing a door that was simply open, suddenly, as though it had always been open. Now you know what was happening inside that trailer. Wayne was not sulking. He was not staging a power display. He was not negotiating through silence in the way that stars sometimes do when they want concessions they're too proud to request directly. He was thinking. Specifically, he was working through a question that he had been circling for 43 years. Whether the performance of accessibility, the confession that a character isn't quite legitimate until he opens himself up in ways that an audience finds comfortable, was something a man of craft could in good conscience produce. He thought about it for 2.5 days. He arrived at his answer. He got up. He walked to stage 12. He played the scene as written. One decision. One man. One lesson that history almost filed away and forgot. Returned to that image one more time. Dressing room B, white aluminum, morning light, a California pepper tree casting its particular broken shade across the door. The thermos still on the step. 114 people assembled on the other side of a lot, waiting on a word from a man who was busy making sure the word was right. There is, in the 43-year history of John Wayne's career, one confrontation that was never filmed, never reviewed, never cited in any of the retrospectives that accumulated after his death. It happened not on a set, not in a saloon, not on a battlefield or a frontier. It happened in a man's own mind, over 2.5 days, in a room with the shades pulled. He won it the way he won most things, by not leaving until he was certain. But there was one confrontation John Wayne had earlier in that same year. A conversation with a man who would go on to shape an entire generation of American cinema, that he never spoke about publicly. Not once. Not in any interview, any letter, any memoir. And the reason why he kept it silent, that's a story for another time.